There are podcasts that you can be rude about. In the old days, you felt like you were sort of in the old days, like 4 years ago.
They're calling it the podcast election. The humble podcast has become where political and cultural moments are made.
The most influential political commentators in Britain probably have podcasts now. They're Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart, George Osborne and Ed Balls.
In this episode, we sit down with James Marriott, the man who might just be the world's #1 podcast expert.
The fact that so many podcasts are about politics maybe speaks to the...
He's the voice behind one of the Times' most influential columns, where his reviews can make or break a podcast show.
You sort of felt like you were responsible for, lifting up the rock of podcasting culture and trying to bring the delicate little creatures out into the light.
We uncover the reason why podcasts are now driving political agendas.
The more insatiable the media demand for political stories becomes, the more chaos happens in politics.
How US and UK podcasts are vastly different.
It can just support a more intensive kind of journalism.
And how James went from a nobody on Twitter to catching the attention of top journalists in his early 20s.
I was 23, sitting in my grandma's bedroom where I was living at the time, and you could write an article and it could go viral, and suddenly your face and your writing could be in front of like every editor at a national newspaper.
Through his columns on technology and culture, he has become the voice of a new generation. And perhaps his superpower is explaining new generations to older generations. This conversation takes on an extra dimension when you know it was recorded before the US presidential election. Make sure you subscribe so we can continue to get bigger and bigger guests. James, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. What is your job?
I am a columnist at the Times newspaper.
And what do you specialise in?
That is that question, when I answer it, always makes me sound completely vague and useless, because basically I always end up saying things like culture, society, ideas, which each one of those categories encompasses everything. I guess not politics is probably my beat. Stuff to do with if there's a new film out, social trends, culture in the sense of culture more widely, not just, books and art galleries and things like that. So yeah, that's not a very helpful answer, but it's the only one I can give, I think.
Not politics, though. It's quite
not politics.
Not politics. And how did you get the job? Because you are quite young, as well, as often is made in the comments of your byline picture, as I know, and so on. But how did you get the job?
It was one of those. I mean, it's one of those kind of real journalism flukes that I just feel amazingly lucky to have sort of stumbled in this direction. I started out when I graduated working in a bookshop, writing book reviews. Freelance for places like the Literary Review. A guy at the Times spotted one of my pieces, asked me to write freelance for the Times, and then eventually, with much sort of persistence on my part, that turned into a staff job, which eventually, when I started doing opinion columns, turned into a sort of regular opinion column. I think, mainly thanks to like positive reader feedback and people wanted to read me, and therefore I was there. Is my self-flattering interpretation.
And what does a staff writer do?
So what they do is, I guess, have more job security than a freelance writer. That's probably the main thing that everyone on staff is grateful for. And my job comes with the particular obligation to write a column every week. I also review podcasts, and then usually there's something else. There'll be a book review or a feature or an interview or something like that needs writing.
So you're kind of doing 3 pieces a week then, almost, the main column.
Yeah, sometimes more, sometimes less.
And so how does your week structure, and classic question, but where do you get the ideas from?
My week basically is a kind of whirlpool that revolves entirely around the panic of trying to write an opinion column, which used to be Thursdays, is now Tuesdays. So my Sundays are trying to think of an idea, pitching it to the comment desk, usually pitching 3 ideas. Stay up very late Sunday night, panicking, reading, pulling books off shelves, phoning people, trying to kind of gather material, beginning to write very late Sunday night, going to bed midnight, waking up first thing the next morning, frantically continuing to write, and then sort of weirdly, the most stressful part of my week ends about sort of 4 p.m. on a Monday when I file. And then the rest of the week unfolds at less intensity from there, basically. But that's the fulcrum of my week.
Right. And what do you do on a Tuesday? Do you read the comments? Do you engage with them? Or do you...
Tuesday, it is always very hard to avoid reading the comments. It's a form of madness. And yeah, I'm trying to train myself to stay away, because even when they're good, you shouldn't that's as dangerous as when they're bad.
Okay.
It's horrible to be insulted, but then it's also dangerous to sort of start realizing what people like and then to try and feed them more of what they like when you should be thinking independently. So if I really want to know, I'll usually get my girlfriend or someone I know to sort of like glance at them and give me the gist of what's going on without me obsessing over ideally without me obsessing over every single comment and and then getting that dangerous subconscious thought of like, well, Dan79146 really enjoyed when I said this about, wokeness. So I've got to say that next week, and that way madness and insanity lies.
But I was fascinated in reading some of the your pieces and so on that you've done around subjects. You actually describe yourself as not a great writer, but you've found a job as a writer.
Why did I describe myself as not a great writer? That was maybe unduly self-deprecating of me. I think I'm all right.
Yeah, quite.
I find it difficult. That might be something like what I said. I find it very stressful.
Yes. And so how does the week unfold from a Tuesday then? Because obviously you are also the sort of lead podcast reviewer now as well, which is a totally new job in itself because podcasting really exists 5 or 6 years ago. So how do you do your kind of podcast selection, etc.? How does that work?
I mean, that is probably unreassuringly unsystematized. I mean, it's just like anything, it's really interesting how podcasting's changed. When I started, I was desperately trying to search the internet, working out what was new, what was worth reviewing. There'd always be some bloke in his shed in rural middle America who'd made this like gorgeous sort of 100-part series about the swan or something. You'd be like, wow, this is amazing. It's way more professionalized, the industry now. I'm bombarded by PR emails, bombarded by, suggestions from colleagues. People have got ideas for things. They've heard of things. And I guess half the job is endlessly trying to sort through that, find out what looks interesting, give things a fair listen, to see whether it's worth recommending. I mean, the thing I find now is often most weeks, maybe every other week, there's a podcast that I have to do because some new celebrity's got a podcast.
Yeah.
Goalhanger, the behemoth of podcasting, has launched. The rest is, I don't know what they're on to now. I mean, the rest is everything, and that will have to be reviewed because that will automatically be interesting to listeners. And in a way, that's a little more fun because it means there are podcasts that you can be rude about. In the old days, you felt like you were sort of, in the old days, like 4 years ago, you sort of felt like you were responsible for, lifting up the rock of podcasting culture and trying to bring the delicate little creatures out into the light and show everyone how marvelous it was. Now, you've got all kinds of, boring celebrities prattling on in their podcasts, and it's, I mean, maybe, pot calling the kettle black here as I prattle on a podcast, but it's nice to be able to be rude about people sometimes and tell them off for being boring. That's invigorating.
And what do you think makes a good podcast in 2024 as we are now? What's the modern age of podcasting? What are the ingredients that make it work?
I mean, there are basically two kinds of podcasts. There is one where people sit in a room chatting a bit like this, and there's another kind which is becoming less popular now because it is more expensive to make, and I think people are thinking the returns aren't quite what they thought it would be, which is, I guess, the sort of investigative journalism podcast. Either you have a true crime case or you have a conspiracy theories are very popular and somebody spends a lot of money going to investigate it, going to speak to people in the local community, going to find out what happened. And I think, I mean, those are great. They're incredibly labor intensive. There was an idea for a while that you'd make money from these things by creating IP, intellectual property, selling it onto Netflix, turning it into a documentary, and you just keep spinning money out of the idea. I think that seems not to have happened, and people are trying to do things that are a little less cost intensive. So the ideal podcast in 2024, I think, really is the show with two people chatting that will live or die, regardless of the subject and regardless of the expertise of the hosts, on their personal relationship and their charisma. And if you look at all of the really successful Goalhanger podcasts, because this is the thing Goalhanger has nailed, things like The Rest is Entertainment, The Rest is Politics, The Rest is History, they all have brilliantly charismatic relationships between the two hosts, and that's kind of all you need to nail, really. Yeah. I mean, it's much harder than it sounds. Finding those relationships is difficult.
Yeah, that alchemy is not straightforward. And how do you think podcasts will potentially impact culture?
I think in all kinds of ways. I mean, I think we're sort of over the last, 10, maybe longer, 15 years, we've been on a bit of a journey from a culture that was more text-based. I think even the early internet was very text-based, an inheritor of, the age of books and magazines and print journalism into one that is much more audio and image based. And I think a lot of our culture is going to head in that direction. I mean, you can see it as an opinion columnist, you notice it. The commentators once upon a time who are really culturally relevant and who were important and who were listened to and who could sway things were op-ed columnists, people who wrote 1,000 words a week interpreting culture and politics. That's not really true anymore. I mean, the most influential political commentators in Britain probably have podcasts now. They're Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart, George Osborne and Ed Balls, bizarrely on their podcast. And
it's amazing to see Osborne this week going around the sort of media conference at Tory Party conference. It was kind of weird sort of seeing pigeonholing candidates to get 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know he's crossed the sort of the firewall from politics to the media, as many people do, I guess, nowadays, and that's going to be important. I think we're only at the beginning of that journey, and the audience of the rest of politics is massive, millions and millions of people, more than any op-ed columnist will get, and I think people will just be a lot more of our media will shift in that direction. I've also had interesting.
Why do you think it's so politics heavy though? The podcast sort of it feels quite sort of politics heavy in the sense of that's where a lot of the big podcasts are now. I mean, that may be my biases slightly talking as well, but maybe it'll tail off next year when it's not an election year so much.
I think that's partly our biases because we're people who are interested in politics and we're paying attention to a lot of it. I mean, there's stuff like, Joe Rogan is the most popular podcast in the UK. It's kind of political often, but it's not primarily political. The Diary of a CEO, the Steve Bartlett podcast, that's not that political. There are a lot of podcasts, two parents talking about their kids, two friends just joking. But I guess the fact that so many podcasts are about politics maybe speaks to the audience of podcasting, which is still a young industry, is still probably overwhelmingly appeals to relatively educated, relatively young, middle-class people. It's quite metropolitan. And I think the audience of podcasts will grow and podcasts will diversify as the audience grows. But the podcasts that are really huge kind of speaks to the sorts of people who listen to podcasts, which are university-educated professionals, I think, disproportionately compared to the population as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also think the political ones do end up sort of then slightly being covered more in the sort of mainstream press than the kind of like comedian podcast.
Yeah, because the mainstream press is obsessed with politics as well.
Yes. Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's what newspapers are set up to do, isn't it? Really, to cover politics. I guess that's sort of the primary function. I mean, I'd love to live in a world where newspapers were like, a new book came out. Our front page is a new novel. But I think realistically, circulation would collapse, and that wouldn't be the most responsible way of dealing with the news, really.
Yeah, well, I often think about it, but in particular in terms of the business coverage, like it's just there can be some really big business stories, and they don't, politics and the commentary on politics, and you've seen it increase as well in the last few years with Talk TV, GB News as well. Like, obviously not just newspapers, but that whole kind of like media space is just seems to be ever more dominated by politics.
Yeah, and I guess that's partly politics has been more dramatic recently than it has been, in many decades. It's a lot more chaotic and a lot more. It's a much more of a brilliant, if depressing story, and partly it goes the other way around. The more insatiable the media demand for political stories becomes, the more chaos happens in politics because, the media is endlessly trying to look for stories and trying to kind of, create a bit of exciting chaos and scandals and stuff. And it's sort of, I guess, those two things feed each other.
We talk a lot about future tech and innovation here. So when it comes to staying securely connected anywhere, NordVPN's new eSIM product, Saily, is a real game changer. My team and I tested it on holiday, and setup was a breeze, no SIM swapping or roaming headaches. Just instant, secure connectivity. If you want that same peace of mind, Saily's got you. Backed by NordVPN's trusted security, it keeps your data safe while you stay seamlessly connected. Head to nordvpn.com/JimmyJobs for 15% off, or check the link below. We've used it, we love it, and we think you will too. You've been a little bit of a skeptic on some of your pieces, which is often why I enjoy reading them, because sometimes I don't necessarily always agree with them, but they always make me think around AI and AI potentially being overhyped, particularly at the moment. How do you think, though, it could impact media and journalism over the next 10 to 20 years?
I mean, I should say that I'm not all my sort of attempts to write about AI come from a position of attempting to be a skeptical non-expert. I don't really have any expertise. I just sort of, all I can do is judge the tone of the discourse around it, I guess. It's so hard to say. I mean, my skepticism slightly comes from the fact that I think there's a tendency that whenever there's a new technology, we live in an incredibly techno-optimist culture. You know, we're used to, you know, more than, 200 years of endlessly, relentlessly advancing technology. And we have this kind of, I think, subconscious assumption that technology is a kind of magic. And when we have this thing put in front of us that we're told is AI, and I think people have interestingly disputed the idea that ChatGPT really is AI at all.
Yeah.
We kind of think, oh, this fantastic form of new magic, it will only be, 5 seconds before it's taken over the world, has enslaved us, is doing all of our jobs. And I think some of that tendency comes less from people's knowledge of what artificial intelligence is and how it works, and more from their kind of inherited cultural assumptions about having been fed sci-fi films for their entire lives and having grown up in a culture that obsesses over technological progress. I think there's an interesting counter-argument, which I do believe isn't taken seriously enough, which is made by people like Gary Marcus, who I guess is the preeminent AI skeptic, which is that ChatGPT does some things fantastically well. It produces serviceable text brilliantly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should extrapolate from that it will do everything brilliantly. The analogy AI skeptics use is growing a tree to the moon. You grow a tree and for the first 30 years you go, oh my God, this tree is growing so quickly. This is amazing. It's going to get to the moon in 100 years. But actually a tree only grows so far and so fast, and it is a particular technology that can do a particular thing. And the generative AI is maybe not the AI technology that will take you to the moon. And people like Gary Marcus would say there are other kinds of AI, like neurosymbolic AI, which would be required to get the kind of super intelligence that is the stuff of sci-fi fantasies. And insofar as I'm able to understand it, I don't know whether that argument is true or not, but I think it's underheard in our culture at the moment. And we could all probably, a note of skepticism is important to inject because people have gone so nuts over it, I think.
Yes, I think that's fair. And where do you think the opportunities might be in journalism for it? I mean, content production is one where it is inevitably going to get easier. We see it on a podcast, right? Like, it's much easier now to chop up, put subtitles in, etc. Where do you think the opportunities might be for?
Yeah, well, I mean, opportunities is a kind of more optimistic word than the one that I would choose to use. I mean, opportunities for job loss and stuff like that. I guess, as everybody says, and obviously as a columnist, I hope it doesn't go any further. The obvious opportunity is producing the very sort of, run-of-the-mill generic content. Top 10 places to stay in X. Here's your itinerary for this place. Top 10 movie stars who did this and have this color hair, and that sort of, I guess people call it journalism, that absolutely clogs up the internet. And I mean, that's everywhere. If you Google this kind of thing, you can quite easily open a website that is just feeding you AI generated copy. I guess, my hope is that it either never gets more sophisticated than that and it just stays at this kind of generic mulch creation ability, or that part of the appeal of a text isn't merely what it says, but the fact that it is, created by another person and is sincerely meant by somebody and represents somebody's, thoughts and feelings rather than just being created out of nothing. And
we'll come on to the job losses, because that's where we initially sort of started corresponding about psychology and the uptake in that. But on that sort of, being a voice and so on, like, you've become this sort of new voice for generation of, how would you sort of describe yourself? The sort of young millennial or top end of the Gen Z?
Yeah, no, I'm a slightly older millennial. I'm older than I look. I'm a young millennial. I'm 31. So
okay, yeah, young.
Hang on, the bottom end of, because there are some millennials who are in their 40s now, I think.
Yes, well, because so if you take it from 1981, then yes.
Yeah, so I'm younger millennial, but a few years away from being a Gen Z.
Yes, And how do you, because there's an argument that Rishi Sunak's almost a millennial because he's born in 1980, which has already meant that millennials have had their turn running the country. But anyway, how do you sort of feel being the kind of one of the leading voices of that generation now and having one of the kind of biggest platforms on it?
I mean, I think that's definitely an exaggeration. I think compared to if you go into YouTube and you go into sort of TikTok, or you go into even people with viral Twitter accounts, I think they have far bigger platforms, and I think and would be far more known than I am, I guess.
No, okay, but you're making that's okay, fair and humble of you, but you're making it to the older generation. You're being, a voice for a younger generation to sort of a times demographic. So how does that responsibility feel, perhaps?
Yeah, I suppose it's true. I don't think about it that much. I guess if I do represent anything like that, I think the shift in sensibility doesn't fall along generational lines. I think older millennials have much more in common with Gen X culturally and in terms of their economic experience. I think there's a real kind of cut-off point, and I think it's to do with who grew up with the internet, that comes sort of midway through the millennial generation. And I think it's that generation that grew up online that appears really new and different to what came before, and has probably proved quite baffling to older generations. Because I almost think I sort of lived through the very middle of this shift in generational sensibility at university. I remember being told at the time that the year above me at university they were all down the college bar all the time. They were drinking constantly. It felt like a very sort of traditional, early 2000s style, 1990s style university experience. The year below me at university was renowned for being very abstemious, working constantly, very censorious, very sort of morally preoccupied with, climate change and identity politics and things. And it was in, I think, my final year at university that all this stuff broke out. In university, which for 2 years had been a very kind of apolitical experience, in my final year just erupted into scandals and controversies over, I guess, what we'd now call wokeness, identity politics, cancellation, all this kind of stuff. And I suppose I sort of have followed that generational experience, which is not, as I said, a generational experience, but it's kind of that new mid-generational thing that comes with a generation that grew up online that has definitely changed the sensibility of people born, I guess, probably after like 1992, 1993. And I think that's the real shift. And that's the phenomenon that maybe I was able to explain to older readers, kind of somewhat belonging to it, but being in many ways very skeptical of it, especially a lot of the sort of wild reaches of identity politics.
So what years were you at university then?
I was at university 2011 to 2014. And I think it was about 2013 that I really noticed this sort of explosion of, I guess you'd now call them cancellations, people being kicked out of Facebook groups, people having accusations flung at them. Yeah. It was the year I graduated that The Spectator published a cover story about the Stepford students, which always stands out to me as I think the first time the phenomenon of the idea that students were no longer like wild and drinking and having a great time, but were actually, censorious and abstemious and morally very certain, kind of hit the mainstream. And I think I happened to be at university at the time that wave sort of first crested.
Yeah. But why I was thinking about it partly was because I wonder about the impact of the financial crisis and also fees going up as well.
Yes, I think that's certainly part of it.
Sort of all mixed in. But I also think that one of the things that happens is generations are actually getting much shorter, where you can almost put them into sort of 3-4 year blocks, as opposed to sort of the big kind of 15 years that we allocate to millennials. Right?
Yes, because technology is moving so much quicker, and that changes people's experience of growing up really profoundly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you're thinking of writing your pieces, do you sort of think about the references that you might have to make for Times readers to understand it rather than younger references, or no?
I don't really. I mean, that may just be because my references are somewhat archaic and I'm a slightly old-fashioned person. I think also, if you're reading, newspaper readers are usually very well informed. If you're reading a broadsheet newspaper, you have a very wide cultural knowledge and are actually more up to date on a lot of things than a stereotype might suggest. I've never thought about that, no. I mean, I guess if I had to reference, like, I don't know, some kind of TikToker who I've never heard of, it might require some explanation. But I think you can assume knowledge on the part of your readers. And something that Caitlin Moran says, which I think is true, is that often readers don't mind not getting a reference. She makes the point that when she was growing up reading newspapers, one of the exciting things was discovering a reference that she didn't quite understand, going away, looking up a new musician, a new writer, or a new, celebrity or whatever, and sort of being shown quite incidentally a whole new world. And it doesn't, not understanding can be part of the, I guess, exciting part of reading.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I can totally see that. And let's focus on the skills aspect of the future. And one of the columns that you wrote around A-level results time was about sort of psychology appearing from nowhere to become the second most studied topic at A-level. And I was also asked by it on the day by Adam Bolton of Times Radio, so it's partly why it really stuck with me. But actually I was a bit more on the sort of positive side, talking about AI, thinking that psychology is actually a little understood subject, and understanding the human brain, whether it's mental health, etc., could actually be quite a sort of prominent thing. But you were a bit more of a skeptic of why people were studying psychology?
I mean, I find this such a fascinating story. Basically, psychology has replaced English literature, I think, in the sort of A-level popularity stakes. So English literature used to be the most popular subject at A-level. It was when I graduated. It's now fallen. It's not even in the top 10 anymore. Psychology is now the second most popular A-level. History used to be very popular. Yeah. That has declined a lot, and I think that has probably been replaced by sociology, which is also extremely popular. I think my perception of what's driving it is changing ideas of cultural prestige and cultural capital. I think still when I was studying at A-level, literary culture and books had an enormous amount of inherited prestige from the last 100 years of British culture, English speaking culture. Books are incredibly culturally central. They're incredibly important. They caused a huge amount of, I guess, what we'd now call discourse. Reading was an important marker of being an intelligent, culturally interested, in touch person. I think that has really fallen away with the rise of social media. I mean, we know from statistics and we know from all kinds of compelling anecdotal evidence that teenagers just read a lot less than they did. Yeah. And I think the idea of studying poetry at A-level would now seem a slightly unobvious, weird thing to do compared to, when I did my A-levels slightly more than 10 years ago. It would have seemed like a really obvious, much more central thing to study, and quite a prestigious thing to study. It was associated with, being educated, being, probably, it had a cultural prestige that it now lacks. I think psychology has kind of replaced it, partly because psychology has a lot of cultural prestige. If in the past you might be expected to shine at a dinner party by being able to say that you'd read the latest novel and show an understanding of the latest novel, or maybe you'd be able to, at a really pretentious dinner party, quote a line of poetry and everyone think, oh, that's very educated of you. I think now that place has been taken by psychology. I think there's a language of psychology that is incredibly culturally prevalent, probably to do with, I guess, what we'd call therapy speak, discussing who's a narcissist, who is all this stuff about, what's it called? Attachment styles. There's this whole jargon of psychology, which is incredibly popular, I think has come out the internet. And I think that is now probably associated with a kind of humanistic cultural prestige, being a sort of in touch, emotionally in tune, educated person. And I think that is the sort of cultural flip that's taken place there. And
why do you think that is? It comes down to the status of impressing people at dinner parties in your 20s.
I mean, I think that's sort of one way of putting it. But I think cultural prestige is a much deeper phenomenon and informs an awful lot of what we do. And I think the cultural prestige of literature has really collapsed in the last 15 years. Yeah. It's not remotely as culturally central as it was. And I guess literature and psychology are fulfilling some of the same appetites. The natural human wish to talk about emotions and feelings and understand people. And the prestigious way of doing that is now psychology, not literature. And people have, I think, followed the sort of prestige of psychological discourse, which is everywhere on social media, and the prestige of English literature, which has sort of collapsed in the meantime, is increasingly irrelevant, I think.
Yeah, and it also fits in partly with the whole sort of rise of mental health understanding.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
side
And those are, I mean, there's a very moral, I mean, there's a kind of moral element to it too. I think once upon a time we'd have thought, you know, literature had a moral purpose. It's a very popular idea in the Cold War. Literature was this kind of humanistic tool that could help you understand individuals, could help you be a better person, could help you be more fulfilled, person with more meaning in your life. I don't think people think about literature that way so much anymore. And I think actually the moral element, that moral value now accrues to psychology. You know, if you understand people, if you're empathetic, if you care about people's mental space and boundaries and stuff, you are somewhat fluent in the language of mental health. And I think that is another part of the same story.
How much do you think it's changed though, because printing has got so much cheaper over the last 20, 30 years as well? So therefore, you know, to write a literary novel, there used to be a much higher bar, whereas now it's actually much cheaper to kind of produce, and there's probably more authors than there's ever been.
Is that true? I mean, I guess publishing online is cheaper. I think, I mean, I know recently, at least, paper costs have been rising, and it's more expensive to print newspapers at the moment and more expensive to print books. And I think books have actually gone up in cost, I think, in advance of inflation. I think that's right. I could be wrong there. But I guess...
I suppose what I really mean is via the internet, right? It's become much easier to sort of, you know, put pen to paper in that sense.
Yes, and there's a kind of proliferation of blogs and social media posts. And maybe that sort of blurred the boundaries between, you know, the traditional prestige of authorship, which involves a publisher, and a kind of amateur version, which is just you making a Substack post. That's probably blurred a lot. And actually, you know, I would say a lot of the writers I really rate and think are brilliant, many of them are on Substack and just publishing off their own bat. And many people I think are less good have, you know, platforms in the traditional media. And that the sort of prestige between self-published and published by a traditional media brand is very blurred and will only blur further, I think.
Yes, although I have a bit of a theory on the Substack model in the UK, but it won't work as much, partly because of the BBC and people being used to being able to get news for free, and also the fact that we don't have a tipping culture means that people are much less likely to sort of pay £5 or £6 per month to read, whereas in the US it will be much bigger. Yeah,
I mean, the other thing the US has is just much vaster economies of scale. Yeah. I mean, the cliche about US journalism is that, you know, every single article in the New Yorker is written by some guy who writes 3 pieces a year. He's sent off to immerse himself in the life of, you know, some kind of Romanian novelist for 6 months, and then he'll like think about it for another month and then write it up and spend ages doing it. And the resulting piece will be 15,000 words and not read by that many people. But because the US just has a much bigger population than Britain, it can just support a more intensive kind of journalism, and the audience for, you know, long form, more complicated journalism is just much bigger in the US because the population is bigger. And I think, Substacks benefit from all journalism benefits, all forms of journalism just benefit from the fact you have more available subscribers for more different kinds of stuff. And UK journalism has always had to be a bit nimbler, a bit more budget, a bit sort of smarter about how it, you know, positions itself.
When it comes to the status of jobs and that side of things, how do you think that has changed in the 21st century? And I should have mentioned it earlier, but I'm in a slightly older generation, so I've just turned 38, and my sort of side of it is growing up at school, didn't use the internet at the beginning, but at university, cannot imagine doing my degree without it as well. So I feel like part of that real kind of like crossover sort of generation with it, as it were. But one of the things that I've sort of noticed, I graduated in 2009, you know, in the noughties, investment banking was like the status job, and that has sort of changed quite a bit. Obviously still quite a high status job, but has been replaced much more by technology firms and consulting firms as well. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on how the job market status has changed, or job status rather than job market status.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, I guess there are probably a couple of shifts from the idea that the most statesful thing to do is investment banking, which I think are sort of partly to do with moral purpose and partly to do with how interesting and personally fulfilling your job is. So I think if investment banking has lost social status, it's because it's probably not thought of as moral, and, you know, we have it's a cliched idea, but I think it's true, is that the kind of rising generation is much more preoccupied with moral issues, with climate, with things like that. And I think there's an effort to, if your job is morally worthwhile, I think that has more status than it once would have done. For all the sort of social changes we've been talking about. I think also the other important shift is that people are just much keen to have jobs that look personally more fulfilling and meaningful and worthwhile. I was reading a great piece recently about the changing job titles that are advertised on kind of job websites in America, and there's the kind of rise of the cool job title. Like you're not like the social media manager, you're like the social media ninja coordinator, all these kind of nonsense words. And you might want an office filled with bean bags and with a ping pong table, all these cliches. And I think this arises from the fact that the deal you make with your employer now is not, I will give you a certain amount of my time in return for a nice life. I'll be able to buy a house. I'll have a family. I'll find my meaning there. The deal is, well, I want a job, but the meaning of my life may not be enabled by my job because I can't really afford to go and buy a house. I can't really afford to have a family. Therefore, I demand that my job supplies me with a bit more meaning and a bit more purpose and a bit more kind of interest in my life, because I can't get that elsewhere, because that has, that sort of disappeared due to, house prices and kind of other difficult economic factors.
Yeah. What else was that article saying? That sounds...
Oh my God, what else was it saying? All kinds of things. I wish I could remember the exact job titles because they were all totally ridiculous. And the statistic was something like jobs with the word ninja in the title have risen by like 300% in the last 10 years in America. I've made that statistic up, but it was illustrative of the idea that people now want job titles that sound like cool and meaningful and not boring and corporate. And I think that's because jobs are now a source of purpose that we find it hard to get elsewhere because of difficult economic conditions.
And how else do you think that status is changing? We were chatting just beforehand, but you wrote a brilliant piece on the sort of Hackney half, and I've often thought that running has become much more of a kind of status symbol, which is funny in the sense of like pre-19th century being strong, or perhaps even going even further back, but that was really important actually, and that sort of almost dipped in the 20th century. Being physically strong wasn't perhaps as important as the kind of decades went by, but now becoming fit again in a different sense has become really important.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, my thesis in that piece I wrote about the Hackney Half Marathon was that an obsession with marathon running kind of ties into the preoccupations of an incredibly competitive meritocratic middle class that is obsessed with personal achievement, personal bests, beating people. And that's the product of, I guess, a more straitened economic circumstances. The competition for jobs is greater. More people are university educated. Success requires, to be successful, you have to be really competitive and well honed. And I think that is sort of, my thesis was that's something that had bled over into leisure time as well. And people who've been raised and bred for success in a competitive meritocracy take those values over into their leisure time and don't want to just relax. They want to run faster than other people, measure their time, do better. And that professional ethic has become part of the ethic of private life as well, I think.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I was thinking about it the other day, actually, because I was on a run and I thought it was pouring down rain. And I had this sort of flashback to my old sports coach saying the problem is with you, McLoughlin, is you're only interested in when people are watching, etc., and you're not interested in doing it when no one's around and so on. And I thought, and that problem's been solved by social media now, in the sense of like you can go for a run on your own, but then share it with the world.
I'm sure that's part of it actually, because social media allows you to show off all aspects of your life, and you can we know how competitive it makes people. I'm sure having Strava and being able to show how far you've run to your friends and acquaintances is a huge motivation for a lot of people to go running.
Yeah, exactly. And how do you think that will how do you think status might change in the next 10 years? What do you see with the generation coming through? Because you also wrote a fabulous piece a little while ago about sort of going on a tour of universities and how that had all changed quite dramatically, even in the sort of 7 or 8 years since you'd left.
So I think there's one important story here, which is set out in a really brilliant book by two sociologists called Sam Friedman and Aaron Reeves, called Born to Rule, which is a changing study of elite leisure time and elite cultural preoccupations. And they take 100 years of how people at the top of society, and I guess also in the upper middle class, spend their time, and they basically identify three phases of elite culture. They do it in all kinds of really brilliant ways. So they go through who's who, and they look at all the occupations people list as their leisure activities and who's who, and they chart how that has changed. And they find that at the beginning of the 20th century, everyone in who's who was listing things like, my activities are hunting, shooting, fishing, sailing, the traditional leisure pursuits of the aristocracy, outdoorsy stuff, the kind of leisure pursuit that signals your status through the fact that you have an estate to go shooting pheasants on, that you have the money to have a boat. And the next phase of elite leisure pursuits they identify as in the, I guess, early and mid 20th century, which is the rise of highbrow culture, which is when people stop saying, I love shooting, I love sailing. And who's who is suddenly flooded with people saying, I collect Chinese porcelain, I write poetry, I love speaking multiple languages, I appreciate difficult classical music. And their thesis for this change is that as the traditional aristocracy in Britain declined at the beginning of the 20th century, and people who had new money through industry began to rise into it, traditional elites had to find a way to differentiate themselves. And they no longer had more money than the people who had risen into the upper ranks of society through industry, but they could have more cultural status. So then they started signaling their cultural status more, obsessively. And then the third phase of this story, which I think we're still in, which is really interesting, is that ever since about the 1950s, the change has been much more towards people signaling much more egalitarian cultural pursuits. So opera, ballet and stuff begins to fall out of who's who, and people are saying, I just love a beer with my mates. I love spending time with my family. I love watching TV. And their idea behind this is that we live in a culture that is, if not actually meritocratic, at least formed by a meritocratic value system. And what you want to signal is not, I owe my place in society to inherited wealth and inherited cultural capital. You want to signal, I came from a quite ordinary background. I'm a normal kind of person. And the fact that I'm in who's who, or the fact that I'm in, this relatively elevated echelon of society is all due to my own hard work and my own merit. And I'm going to show you that it's all to do with my own merit by the fact that I have these really quite ordinary interests, which signal I'm an ordinary kind of person who's just exceptionally accomplished, rather than somebody who was taken to the opera by their parents as a kid and, was educated in Renaissance art by their great aunt and all this kind of stuff. I think that's really profoundly true. And I think that is still going on and still shaping our culture.
And how do you think that will continue to do? Because there is an interesting bit as well. It's become very in vogue for politicians to talk about the jobs their parents did, etc. as part of that as well, right? Pharmacist, toolmaker, etc. That's become very kind of like part of our political culture now as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that, this another book full of these great little statistics, but the extraordinary number of people in professional and managerial jobs in Britain who now describe themselves as working class. The next statistic is the equally extraordinary number of people in professional and managerial jobs whose parents are also in professional and managerial jobs who describe themselves as working class. There's a lot of status in appearing to be someone from an ordinary background who has arrived at, your relatively successful position through merit rather than through inherited privilege. I just think that will keep continuing. And I mean,
but why has that? Because that's such a sort of bizarre thing, really, when you think about it.
I mean, I think it's to do with the ideology of meritocracy in the post-war era, which I guess has kind of ground to a halt somewhat now. We live in a less meritocratic society than we did perhaps in the 60s when there's real dramatic social change. But I think suddenly there was a feeling in the 60s that it was kind of cooler to be someone who'd made their way to the top of society by being, maybe like a brilliant musician like a Rolling Stone, or someone who'd fought their way up from a difficult background. And that implied that you yourself were kind of personally brilliant rather than that your advantages had been bestowed on you. The other interesting point that Sam Friedman and Aaron Reeves make in their book, which I think is probably true, is that since the 1980s, the top kind of 1 or 2% of society has really pulled away in terms of wealth from the rest of society. Yeah. And they speculate there's maybe a feeling of discomfort among the very wealthy at quite how much richer they are than the rest of society. And there's a desire to kind of play down that wealth and play down quite how much material advantage they've accrued relative to ordinary people in the last, 30 years. And that by trying to appear a bit normal, you're kind of trying to put into the background a bit quite how outrageously wealthy you are. I mean, you remember in Succession, all the characters addressing these very kind of dull grey hoodies and stuff. Is it called stealth wealth?
Yes.
Is the trend? And there's a bit of, I guess, an element of discomfort among the very wealthy about really quite how privileged an advantage they are.
And particularly been helped by 2 massive bouts of quantitative easing post-financial crash and pandemic, which I think we're still sort of feeling as well. How do you think the status of being a journalist has changed?
I think it's really declined. I mean, probably because I am a slightly old-fashioned kind of person. I really grew up with the idea that being a journalist was going to be this amazingly glamorous thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think if you're growing up now, you have that sense. You're probably less likely to read a newspaper if you're a teenager than I was. And I imagine stuff like being a YouTuber, being a podcaster like you.
Yes.
I guess I think that probably is more statusful just because podcasters and YouTubers are more popular, more admired.
I know, but in a way it's bizarre though, isn't it? Because I had this at a wedding a couple of years ago where I told somebody I was a podcaster and they were like, that's the coolest job ever. And
quite right.
Well, yeah, but I was struck by it as well because I was like, if I'd said I was a local radio host, would you have had the same reaction? And because it's basically the same thing, but it's partly a branding exercise, right? Like local BBC Radio Derby probably broadcast to sort of 5,000 people. That's what our listeners were at the time. And yet there was something in the modernness of it that sort of really, impacted these people.
Yes, that's true. And I mean,
it's a bit like there's not much difference between a podcast and a webinar. Everyone thinks webinars are the most boring thing that's...
Yeah, this is not a webinar. Let's be clear, this is not a webinar. Yeah, I think... I guess that's part of the other part of the changing prestige of jobs that we didn't talk about, which is that the tech industry, this is an old story now, has become way more prestigious than it used to be.
Yeah.
People who worked with computers used to be, weirdos with, all their pens lined up in their top pockets and their kind of huge glasses, beetling around the office, kind of fixing your Windows 95 and being, quite socially despised. Now it's like people in hoodies changing the universe with AI and the virtual reality universes and stuff. And I guess podcasting has some of that glamour attracted to it. It seems a bit more technology-ish, and we have a real reverence for technology in our society. So you're getting some of that reflected glamour, I think. Wholly earned, of course.
Oh, yeah. I think also it's partly the control of time as well, isn't it? And I think that's become, maybe it's because I've got a bit older, so I am aware of these biases that you get, but having control over your time is also being seen to be more important. Whereas if you're kind of like a slave to the man or whatever, to the fat controller or whatever, it's not so much. I think that's kind of changing.
Podcaster is also closer to influencer, I think, as well. If you can survive as a podcaster, that implies you've built an audience who'd like you personally, and that is the entire economy of the modern internet media, is people building audiences and relying on those audiences there for survival. And you're closer to that model of fame than the traditional. The BBC has just put you in front of a load of people, and you have that position because some manager has chosen it for you, rather than you've carved it out and have directly gone and appealed to a huge audience. I guess that might be part of it.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I also think the irony of this is that journalists are almost the original influencers, really. Like, there weren't more influential people than journalists in the 20th century.
Yeah, and I guess that's why our prestige is leaking away, because other people are doing that in ways that are probably more attractive to a lot of people than, some guy who just writes 1,000 words of commentary on politics or culture, society and ideas every week. And it is actually true. It's something I noticed as a columnist. And I mean, one of the things that people talk about in podcasting is the parasocial relationships that you develop with podcast hosts and YouTubers. You kind of come to feel a bit like they're your friend.
Yeah.
And that experience, that illusion of friendship, is much stronger when you can see and hear and listen to the person than it is when you're just reading their words. But I do notice it that even as a newspaper columnist, the mere fact of having a picture of my face, shoved in front of you every week, and my words, kind of creates this sort of illusion of intimacy.
Yeah.
And I do get like people sending me emails with like personal problems, like people saying I'm struggling with alcohol or quite intimate stuff, and that is just that parasocial thing. But that is much more powerful in audio and video than it is in 1,000 words of print, I think.
Why do you think they're sending you pieces like that? They're asking for agony aunt advice almost.
Well, I think it's that familiarity. You begin to feel like a friend because you see this person every week. They talk to you every week for 1,000 words, which is more than a lot of people might talk to their friends every week. I guess, I was discussing this with someone else who said that people didn't send him. They I think were more asking him for sort of life advice and stuff and not confessing their problems to him. And he was saying that maybe I just had a more kind of genial persona or something, which I hadn't really consciously done, but maybe I seem like a shoulder to cry on. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, well,
or maybe I just attract kind of weirdos with broken lives who kind of see something themselves in me and are desperately coming for expecting me to share my confession of my, fucked up life or something. I don't know.
Yeah. But I remember there were two GPs growing up. There was one that was much more, I just had much more empathy basically than the other one. And you always kind of wanted to see them. But I also think the audio aspect of it is interesting. And I do worry slightly about this with podcasts becoming basically vodcasts now. Audio, there's two examples that I sort of give on this where I felt much closer to kind of an individual listening to them was I actually listened. Well, initially it was David Cameron listening to his autobiography, and the bit where he talks about the death of his child, Ivan, was so much more intense listening to that audio because his voice just completely changed, understandably. Yeah. And similar, actually, I listened to Joe Biden on Nick Clegg's podcast, which is interesting, and him talking about the death of his son as well just completely changed my sort of perception and kind of, what I kind of thought of Joe Biden, actually. So it's just, it is interesting how it just, that voice relates just much more intensely.
It's a new kind of fame. I interviewed Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell the other week, and obviously nobody has podcasting fame like they have it. And I think Rory Stewart was kind of saying that he found it in some ways a bit disconcerting because when people listen to podcasts in the bath, when they're cooking, when they're all right in your ears.
Yeah.
And it's really, have someone speaking directly into your ears at all the most intimate moments of your life is a really a remarkable new thing that just didn't exist before. Even in the radio and the radio is obviously much more formal and impersonal in its presentation. And I got the impression that people were coming up to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell and really kind of oh my God, it's you, it's my friend. It's how on earth have I bumped into you? This is crazy. I listen to you constantly. Now you're here in front of me. Whereas they pointed out that it's just true to say that an enormous number of commuters are listening to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell every morning.
Yeah.
And the fact that you've happened to bump into them is probably eventually, they are going to constantly bump into Rest is Politics listeners. But for each one of those listeners, it was this almost sort of really intense, almost religious experience to be confronted with someone who they heard every morning. And I remember thinking this again when I went to see them. They did a live show at the Royal Albert Hall. And when they came on stage, it was like rock stars coming on stage. People were screaming. People were really moved to be in the presence of these people with whom they had this very intense, powerful and personal relationship. I remember leaving and hearing a couple of girls who were, I guess, my age, discussing Rory Stewart's trousers and why he worn those trousers and didn't they look good on him. And people feel really intimately towards podcast hosts, potentially, if it works, which the Rest is Politics obviously does.
Oh, completely.
And I think fame like that has not really existed before, and I think it's a new thing.
What, in terms of the parasocial fame?
Yeah, the level of intimacy and the parasocial element of it, I think, is kind of unprecedented. And I guess that's the kind of flame we associate with influencers as well, that sort of really intense thing. Yeah,
but I guess it's partly because it's Gen X also listen to the Rest is Politics, and so therefore understand it much more. Do you think that podcast will sort of continue to, I know that's part of what you interviewed them about, etc.
Yeah.
And so on. And I've talked before on this podcast about some podcasts when I've gone and seen them live, it's actually sort of slightly broken the spell in the sense of it almost feels like a bit of I don't think you're a video game player, but almost when you get to the final level and you sort of play that, it kind of slightly alters it a little bit. In terms of it.
I personally don't think podcasts translate brilliantly live. I know it's incredibly popular and people make tons of money. I think often they make most of their money
from it,
through doing it live. But you kind of remove the intimacy of it. You remove the personal experience of it. For a lot of people, I think it's just being in the presence of somebody. They just want to go and physically verify the existence of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, and the fact that you don't get the intimacy maybe is fine because you got to see them. I remember the other sort of odd thing that I did was I went to see Jordan Peterson doing his live show at the Millennium Dome at the O2 Arena. Huge, massive, massive, massive show. It was a total mess. It was basically the format of the show was like the format of every panel at a provincial literary festival. Jordan Peterson and 4 other people discussed how is society changing? What's happening to modern culture in a kind of stilted, awkward way in front of an audience of thousands? Yeah. And it just completely failed to work. But I think almost that didn't matter. People weren't expecting the same experience. They just wanted to go and like see Jordan Peterson because they feel so intimate with him. They want to like be in his actual real presence.
And why do you think, I mean, this is a much broader society point now, but why do you think the likes of Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate have had such kind of explosions over the last 10 years with predominantly young men?
I think the main factor is just the way that we know that social media is set up to appeal to our worst impulses, to make us angrier, to make us more conspiracist. This is how platforms like Twitter drive more engagement, sell us more advertising. And I think it's just that as tech firms have learned to capitalize on our worst influences, people who appeal to those worst impulses kind of tend to thrive because there's no media firewall of, a lot of the stuff that Jordan Peterson says nowadays, virtually everything that Andrew Tate said, if you tried to print that in a newspaper, even a kind of, boundary pushing tabloid 20 years ago, there'd have been like a team of editors going, you absolutely can't say that. No, don't say it. Yeah. Those boundaries have gone. There is clearly an audience for that. People like to be shocked. People like to be titillated. People love to be dragged into conspiracist directions. And there is no longer a kind of firewall of editors standing between the public and its basest desires. This sounds very snooty and old media of me, but I think it's true. I mean, I was listening to Joe Rogan writing about it a while ago, and you just kind of think, if he was sitting in a BBC studio or a Channel 4 studio 20 years ago, he'd be like dragged out backwards by the producers. He wasn't saying anything particularly controversial. He's just ranting about aliens and COVID vaccines and all this kind of stuff. And they'd just be like, you absolutely cannot say that on television. That's all that's changed. There's the people saying no. Yeah. Newspaper editors, BBC editors, TV people have disappeared. And we can now have whatever we want. And what we want is often not particularly nice. I think that is basically just what's happened.
What did your parents do?
My dad was an English teacher and my mum is how do you describe it, childcare lawyer for Northumberland County Council.
And you wrote about doing a series of different sort of Saturday jobs and working.
Yeah, I did ages ago. Yeah.
It was. How do you think that kind of has impacted your career?
Oh God, I don't know. Has it impacted my career? I guess. I mean, it was a bit of in my.
Because you've done a whole host of things, right?
Yes, and it's probably actually not that abnormal. I guess probably in my father's kind of parenting of me, I think there's a point at which he was fearing that I was an incredibly bookish child who like didn't know the value of anything and was just sitting in my room reading constantly, and I had to be like shoved out into the real world. And I did, car washing. I went door to door, knocking on people's doors and washing their cars. I worked selling mugs in Boundary Mill, which is a retail outlet store in Shire Moor in Newcastle. I did a lot of event waitering at hotels and pubs where, you are kind of agency staff and you're brought in to like serve Christmas dinners to, 100 people for their big Christmas dinner at whatever hotel or pub they go to. Has it impacted me at all? Not really. I didn't like it. I mean, if anything, it sort of confirmed me in my desire to, not be a waiter and to be a writer instead. But I already knew that.
But I do think it will be interesting. One of the things that I sometimes talk about in terms of generational changes is the generation before us probably earned their first money via a paper round potentially. Our generation, to bracket it together, probably earned it via hospitality, actually. And then the generation coming through are probably going to earn their first money online. And I do think that sort of where you earn that first few pounds, I think can be quite an informative experience. Yeah,
that's probably true. And I mean, there's a part of me that would love to be like, I was so in touch with the reality man, the Kamala Harris constantly boasting about how she worked at McDonald's. I think it's preposterous. I think a lot of people have done Saturday jobs. You shouldn't preen yourself too much in it. I mean, an interesting thing is, and my extreme reluctance to do Saturday jobs when I was first encouraged and then forced into doing them by my dad, was the fact that the Saturday job has basically collapsed as a phenomenon. People don't do them anymore in remotely the way that they did, and that is, I think, to do with a generation that, as you were saying, is more online, is less socialized, spends more time in their rooms, probably is much more pressurized about exams, and parents.
It's also more ultra competitive as well, I think.
Much more academically competitive, and there's much more pressure to do well in your exams, and exams suddenly seem way more important than earning money would have done once upon a time. I remember being properly outraged that I had to spend my Saturdays like standing on the shop floor of Boundary Mills being like, are you interested in this mug, sir? This is bone china, this is stoneware, which I invariably got totally wrong. Not in my room as I thought I should have been, studying to like get to Oxford, do my A-levels well. And yeah, I like to think my dad was out of touch on that point and has been disproven by the forces of history.
Completely on that. It's been brilliant to have you on. I wonder if you had a podcast, and I mean, this, the old saying about everyone's got a book in them and that's where it should stay, etc. But if you did a podcast, what do you think you would do it on? I know you appear on Times Radio a lot.
Yeah, well, there may be news on this front coming soon.
Oh, right.
Hopefully, if it works out. But I would love to talk about the kind of stuff I write about in my columns, I guess.
Yeah.
This is the slight difficulty: is how do you say this is a podcast about ideas, society, and culture without it sounding impossibly vague? So I probably have to narrow it down. But that's the stuff that interests me.
I do think that's where sort of the rest is entertainment is quite interesting, because I'm a real fan of that podcast, and actually it's almost, you could almost call it the rest is culture. It's quite,
and they've done it brilliantly actually, and it could so easily have gone totally wrong, and they could have talked about too much, and somehow within that quite wide brief you kind of get a very specific idea of what you're getting, which is that the two hosts know an awful lot about how TV and films and radio and journalism works behind the scenes, and I guess that's the more specific pitch. But yeah, and because I know nothing about it, I find it particularly interesting. I do sometimes joke that it could be called The Rest is Analog, because I do think I think they've mentioned YouTube once in sort of 50 episodes or wherever they are on it now. Yes.
I think that is it's a massive part of entertainment.
That's
now.
true. I mean, although to be fair, I think that's one of the things that podcast does really well, which is that modern, even analog culture is so totally scattered, and there's so much of it, and you can never really see the whole cultural landscape. You're in your little bubble and you see what you want to see, and culture's much more siloed than it used to be. And that podcast, I always kind of feel I can listen to, and it can kind of tell me all this stuff that I would have known 20 years ago, like what's the discourse about the most popular film at the moment, like what's the big show on TV, what's the novel that everyone's talking about, that I no longer know, simply because the internet has really changed our experience of even analog culture, and they just can sort of synthesize all that for you and just sort of show you a map of the culture that we just no longer intuitively get from our environment anymore. And I think that's actually a really valuable and useful thing that podcast does.
Yeah, I agree with that. What advice would you give for younger journalists?
My advice is always so terrible, because my path in was so idiosyncratic. I mean, my honest advice would be, start off writing book reviews for particular places. There's a lot of appetite for book reviews, and it doesn't pay very well, but you begin to start writing, and that's a good way of getting noticed. But that's obviously irrelevant to most journalists. They should probably be told to go and do the City Masters course in journalism or something by someone much more sensible than me, who really knows how these things work.
But I think it partly is a real problem now. I mean, it's partly why we set the podcast up, right? Because you often get careers advice from sort of those that are over 50, and the world has changed so much in the sort of 20 to 30 years that they've been doing it.
Yeah.
Like, it's very difficult to sort of have that, and that's why I just think you're really interesting as being one of the prominent sort of younger voices in national newspapers. Like, what's the way to get noticed by a national newspaper?
I mean, again, this is changing, because a couple of years ago I'd have said, as much as we all love to hate Twitter, it's an incredible tool, and was to me early in my career, and to a lot of people I know, where you could be, as I was, like 23, sitting in my grandma's bedroom where I was living at the time, and you could write an article and it could go viral, and suddenly your face and your writing could be in front of like every editor at a national newspaper, or not every editor, but an awful lot of them, because I've been in newspapers and I know that everyone in the building is just scrolling Twitter constantly, and there's your opportunity to just be in front of them. And I realized that, early in Twitter, I was embarrassing presence, telling lots of jokes and stuff, and I cringe when I look back, but I was just getting my face and my jokes in front of people, and I just sort of entered people's mental world, and Twitter was a good tool for doing that. I hesitate to give that advice now, because Twitter is just not what it was. It's harder to get noticed. I think the algorithm suppresses links in a way that it didn't used to. So if you share a link to an article, you're not certain that it's harder to make that go viral, and that culture's changed a lot. And I think it's probably a little bit harder now to be a kind of starting out totally randomly as I was, writing book reviews and things like that, and suddenly finding that I was being read by the literary editor of the Times out of nowhere. That doesn't exist in the same way, but maybe it's still useful. I mean, it's all about brand, isn't it, nowadays? And it's all about being a personality, and using social media to, enter the mental landscape of people who might employ you is probably I think it's still probably good advice, but maybe you have to do TikToks or something that I would never do nowadays. I don't know.
What's the best and worst thing about your job?
The best thing is obviously that I just get to spend my whole life thinking and writing about things that I almost always find interesting and stimulating. The worst thing is now I'm going to sound like I'm whinging about my amazing job. Thinking of ideas is incredibly stressful. Thinking that I've written a not very good column, or I kind of mind people disagreeing with me less than I mind people feeling like I haven't properly made my argument and people have missed the point, which is my fault. That makes me feel sick if I feel like I've not properly convincingly argued to people.
What is the sort of objective? When do you know you've written a really good piece? Like, how are you measuring that?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's totally. I still don't really know. I know which pieces have been popular, and I don't think that necessarily correlates to my best pieces, because often people just like stuff because they agree with it. I think, in hindsight, with a couple of years on, I'll remember certain pieces and think, oh yeah, I think that was particularly well written or particularly well argued, and I'll look back on it and feel less embarrassed than I would reading some of the other stuff I've written, and that's probably the only benchmark. But that I only feel like I know 2 years later.
What's a book you'd wish you'd written yourself?
There is an obvious answer, which is a novel called Leaving the Atocha Station by Ben Lerner, which is just so witty and cool and clever and funny. And if I were capable of writing a novel, which I'm not, I would love to have written that novel. It's just so cool. I love it.
Do you read sci-fi?
Not particularly.
It's interesting. A lot of techies do, don't they? What is a modern day word that's overused that grates on you?
Oh God, it's so obvious to say problematic, isn't it? But it probably is problematic.
And what about in book reviews?
Oh God, I mean, there are so many book review cliches. Meditation. Everything is a subtle and profound meditation on grief. A moving and lovely meditation on love. Meditation is massively overused. It basically, I think, is a synonym for boring.
Have you ever used AI to get over writer's block?
No.
What's a book you started but never finished and feel guilty about?
Oh God. Oh God. What have I tend to finish books. I never finished the Alan Hollinghurst novel Stranger's Child, which I do intend to finish, and I don't know why, because I loved it and got distracted halfway through. But that's not really a particularly profound answer.
No.
That's just an aspect of my life taking over.
What can a film ever be better than a book?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Which example?
Oh God, I don't think I've got a specific instance, but you can imagine a badly written book that is turned into a artful film, I think, but can't think of an instance.
What's your favourite library in the world?
The Lytton Phil in Newcastle upon Tyne, where I spent a lot of time as a teenager, which is beautiful and has a glass dome and a gallery going all around it, and you can get tea and coffee for, I think it was 50p when I was there, probably £1 now.
Yeah.
It's really a wonderful place.
We did an amazing documentary on the North East, and we started it in the Lytton Phil because that's where the first electrical lights were as well. It was,
It's beautiful. It's absolutely wonderful.
If you could travel to any literary period, when would you choose?
I think you have to say Shakespeare's Globe, don't you?
Yeah.
I just can't see how there's another option.
If you could go back in time for 24 hours, when and where would you choose?
Oof, gosh. I mean, part of me, you want to go and see dinosaurs. You want to go and see the Roman Empire. Probably, I mean, just because my preoccupation is literature, I think I would go and try and speak to Shakespeare or watch a play at the Globe or something like that. I think that seems like the most interesting thing for me to do personally. And then I could answer all kinds of obscure academic debates about, which text is the authoritative text of Hamlet or something, and then publish something in Notes and Queries and gain some minor academic prestige. I don't know.
If you could have a dinner with any author, living or dead, who would it be?
Oh, God. I keep saying Shakespeare, but I'm not like some kind of Shakespeare nut. I just think he was such a genius.
Yeah.
If you could talk to him, I'd just be like, do you seem like a normal human being? You seem to have this universal knowledge of humanity and all human emotions and feelings and thoughts. I just, do you come across like an alien from outer space, or do you come across like a normal person? I know that's the same as my 3 previous answers. I should be varying them more, but telling the truth.
If you, what would be your sort of final meal?
Fried chicken and chips, I think.
Right. And what's your favourite drink?
It's such a cliche, but it's called Beaver Oil. It's this particular, I think it's an IPA.
Yeah.
And it's got advertised as skeletons. I think it's called Beavertown Neck Oil or Beaver Oil or something.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just, they serve it everywhere in East London. It's my favourite thing about East London. It's really delicious.
Why did you decide to settle on East London to live as a place?
Because I had a friend who owned a flat in East London and had a spare room to live in, and then I ended up there through reasons of economic necessity.
Fair enough. Would you turn down a job title with the word ninja in it then?
Yes.
What's the best job title anyone's got at the Times?
Oh, God. Editor's very impressive.
Would you ever want to be editor?
No, I'd be terrible at it.
Why?
Writer is writer's probably the job title that I'd most ever aspire to have.
Why do you think you'd be terrible editor?
I'm very disorganised.
I wouldn't have thought that.
Incredibly disorganised.
Okay, great. James,
Thank you.
thanks very much.